Hello, and welcome to today's ESHA webinar, where we will review the updates for Mexico labeling and show you the feature updates included in the Mexico label module that is available for Genesis R&D version 11.9. My name is Alicia, and I'm joined by Rosemarie Sutherland today to bring you this information. But before we get to the main topic, let me give you a little more background on ESHA Research. ESHA was established in 1981 and has grown from offering one of the first nutrition and labeling software solutions to a full suite of products and services, including the Genesis R&D software or foods version of the software, which we'll be showing today, Genesis R&D supplements, the food processor for dietary analysis, and our consulting services that provides labeling services, formula review, and individualized projects. Genesis R&D Foods was introduced in 1991 to help address the need for convenient formula analysis and formatting of NLEA food labels for U.S. regulations. Over the years, Genesis has remained the go-to standard for product development, recipe analysis, and nutrition facts creation, as well as restaurant menu analysis and reporting. We offer label modules to prepare compliant labels for the U.S., Canada, the EU, and of course, Mexico. Each of these label modules is sold separately. So if you do not yet have the Mexico label module that we'll be showing today and need information on obtaining this, please contact the ESHA sales team at sales@esha.com to discuss your license. We are so honored to have Rosemarie Sutherland today to help explain the Mexico labeling regulations and the changes that have occurred since the previous rules. Rosemarie is a certified food scientist and president at Thrive4Life USA. Thrive4Life is a regulatory service provider offering compliance assistance to both U.S. and non-U.S. companies in the food supplement, cosmetics, and drug industries. We're so thankful for her joining us and sharing not only her knowledge of Mexico regulations, but also her industry insight. Please stay tuned for more webinars like this. We will post those on the ESHA website. As new software, regulatory, and industry topics arrive for 2021, we'll keep you informed on how Genesis continues to grow with the latest needs. And you can find all of the previous recorded webinars on the ESHA website in the Events tab. Please note, as always, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording as well as the slide deck following the webinar. Please note that if you do have any questions during the webinar, send those in right away via the GoToWebinar control panel. Don't wait until the end of the webinar. We do have colleagues standing by that can help assist and address those questions. If we don't happen to get to your questions during the webinar, we'll follow up with you directly. Today, we'll be covering the Mexico labeling compliance dates and phases, front of package warning seals and warning statements, the Mexico nutrition facts label, ingredient statement, and allergen changes. And we'll show you updates to Genesis R&D in version 11.9 and the Mexico label module that will accommodate the 2020 Mexico rules. We'll end with the Q&A session. So again, please send in those questions as soon as you think of them. So at this time, I will turn it over to Rosemarie.
Hello, and thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you all for joining us again today. And the first thing that we're going to look at today is the implementation dates. So Mexico published its final modification for this regulation on March 27th of 2020. And it divided the regulation into 3 separate implementation dates for Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. Phase 1 had an implementation date of October 1st, 2020 through September 30th of 2023. Phase 2 has an implementation date of October 1st, 2023 through September 30th of 2025. And Phase 3 is on and after October 1st of 2025. Now, because the government gave such a short time span from when the industry had to implement the initial requirements of Phase 1, they did allow for some enforcement discretion between October 1st of 2020 and November 30th of this year, which just passed. So as of November 30th, all products on the shelves must be in compliance with the initial requirements of Phase 1, which are as of October 1st, 2020. So let's look at an overview of the changes. The first and most obvious change is the warning seals that replaced the icons. Additionally, there's new warning statements that are required on the front of the packaging as well if a product contains specific ingredients. There's new advertising prohibitions for products that are geared towards children if the products require any warning seals or warning statements. There's updates to the nutrition facts label format, which includes the mandatory nutrients, energy calculation, and additionally how sugars are displayed in the ingredient list. There's also a change to how imitation products need to be declared on the front of the package. And the list of allergens has been updated, and there's a new requirement for a may contain statement. So let's look at Phase 1. And this is focused more on the front of packaging labeling. As of October 1st of 2020, those warning seals and warning statements that everyone is talking about must be shown on the front of the package. Now, because again of the short time frame that the industry had to implement this change, the government has allowed for the use of stickers until March 31st of 2021 to add on those warning seals or warning statements. From October 1st through March 31st, these packages that are applying, for instance, stickers or even just adding the warning seals or warning statements could also still be in compliance with the previous regulation requirements. So it's a short time frame where you could see products on the shelves that met both the previous regulation requirements and the requirements of the new regulation for the beginning of Phase 1, which is October 1st, 2020 through March 31st of 2021. What are some exemptions to these products, to these regulation requirements? Any bulk food or beverage, food and non-alcoholic beverages that are packed at the point of sale, prepackaged foods and non-alcoholic beverages that are subject to other specific labeling standards, and other products that are determined by the competent authority. None of these products fall under the new modification to the regulation. The second part of Phase 1 begins on April 1st of 2021. And at that time, all the changes to the nutrition facts labels, the ingredient statements, allergen statements, the statement of identity, and of course, the addition of the front of pack warning seals and warning statements must be added to all packaging. By April 1st of 2021, simultaneously, any advertising that was shown on packaging directed towards children, and this included any games, such as those shown on cereal boxes, digital downloads, etc., anything that was meant to target children, and the product now requires a warning seal or a warning statement, those products can no longer have that kind of advertising. Let's look at the warning seals. So these warning seals that replace the icons, what is the biggest difference between these icons shown on the left and the new warning seals shown on the right? The biggest difference is that the previous front of pack icons were meant to be informative. They were meant to inform the consumer what the product contains for these specific nutrients. The new warning seals are meant to warn the consumers rather than inform them. So rather than communicating the actual amount of these specific nutrients, it's warning them that this product contains more than that amount of ingredient that is recommended for one serving of that product. let's look at what these thresholds are that would trigger any of these warning seal requirements. So these warning seal requirements are actually based on 100 grams of solid product or 100 milliliter for the liquid products. And these are the thresholds that apply to phase 1. As you can see, you have the energy, sugars, saturated fat, trans fat, and sodium. And any values that exceed these values shown on this table would trigger a warning seal requirement. Now, in phase 1, and this is something that differs from phase 1 to phase 3, but in phase 1, you're going to look at these thresholds based on the product formulation. So for instance, for products with added sugars, you will only be evaluating the energy and the sugar threshold requirements. If your product is formulated with added fat, such as butter, oil, etc., anything that is considered a fat, then you only evaluate your energy, your saturated fat, and your trans fat threshold requirements. And for products with added sodium, you would evaluate only the sodium threshold requirements. So even if your product exceeded the threshold limits for any of the other nutrients, you would still only look at the ones that are applicable to your product based on its formulation. So what does this new regulation use as a definition for sugar? So as far as added sugar, which is azúcares añadidos, these are defined as the sugars that are added during the industrial process. And if you're familiar with the FDA definition of added sugars, this is very similar. So the same thing that you would consider an added sugar in the US is applicable to Mexico as well. So if you considered an added sugar when you're doing your nutrition facts for the US, you can take that same interpretation for the Mexico Nutrition Facts panel as well. For the sugars, these are also called free sugars. And these are the available mono and disaccharides that are added to the product, plus naturally occurring sugars in honey and any syrups and fruit and vegetable juices. Phase 2 and phase 3 requirements for these thresholds. The main thing that changes from phase 1 and phase 2 is the specific values in the threshold table. So you will still only be evaluating those thresholds that are applicable to your product based on the ingredients in the formulation, but some of the values have changed in phase 2 from phase 1. So if we look at this table, you'll notice in bold, in the energy column, the number of calories coming from free sugars in a liquid product must be 8 kilocalories or more in phase 2, where in phase 1 it was 10 kilocalories or more. And in sodium, you also have a change in the values that are the threshold requirements. This table of threshold requirements is applicable to phase 3 as well. The main difference between phase 2 and phase 3 is that when phase 3 begins, which is on and after October 1st of 2025, you no longer evaluate the thresholds based on your product formulation exclusive to specific nutrients, but rather if your product has any added sugars, any added fat, or any added sodium, you must look at each one of those columns. So whereas before, if your product had added sugars, for instance, you were only required to look at your sugars and your energy. Now you must also evaluate saturated fat, trans fat, and sodium for phase 3. So that is the biggest difference between phase 2 and phase 3. It's you will be evaluating your product based on all of the columns. Now, based on how many warning seals are triggered by your product formulation and which thresholds are exceeded, the regulation requires that these warning seals be displayed in certain formats. They cannot be displayed in any other way. So if it has one warning seal, it's shown there how it would be displayed. If you have two, they can only be side by side. If it's 3, you could show them all in one row or stacked as it shows right below. And 4 is 2 on top, 2 on bottom, and there you can see how it would look if you had 5 seals as well. So for small packages, though, you do have an exemption where if your product has a PDP of 5 centimeters squared or less, then you would not be displaying all of the seals, but rather one single seal indicating how many warning seals your product was required to bear. So if your product has a PDP of 5 centimeters squared or less, and you are required to display 3 warning seals, you would only display one seal that indicates the number 3 seals underneath on the front of your package. The other requirement for this front of package warning system that's required in this new regulation, or the updated regulation, I should say, is the caffeine warning statement. And this is a requirement that is meant to dissuade children from consuming products that have added caffeine. And so the statement reads that the product contains caffeine and to avoid giving it to children. And what is caffeine? What is meant by caffeine in this new regulation? So it's any caffeine that has been added to the product formulation. So for instance, if you have an energy beverage where you have added caffeine, then this would apply. If it's a product that naturally contains caffeine, such as an iced tea, for instance, this would not require a warning statement. It is only caffeine that is added to the product formulation. The second warning statement that's required by this updated regulation is the sweeteners. This sweeteners warning statement is also meant to dissuade children from consuming products that have sweeteners in the formulation. And the statement reads that the product contains sweeteners and it is not recommended for children. So what are the sweeteners as defined by the Mexican regulation? Sweeteners are defined as substances that are different from mono and disaccharides that impart sweetness to products. And these could be considered natural or artificial. And that's important to note because many people were under the impression that sweeteners might be those that are considered artificial sweeteners or non-nutritive sweeteners, but that is not the case. This is any ingredient that is considered a sweetener as defined by the Mexican regulation and includes this list of sweeteners shown below. And these, as is the case, may or may not be non-nutritive. So when your product requires any of the warning seals or the warning statements, they have to be shown on the top right-hand corner of your PDP. It has to be in that top right-hand corner, and if your product requires a warning statement, it must be shown below the warning seals, directly below with no intervening material. And if the products have any advertising that is directed at children, as of April 1st of 2021, you can no longer have those images of children or anything that it would imply that this product is meant to attract children to consume it. The second part of phase 1 requirements, which begins on April 1st, includes changes to the nutrition facts label. And this is a great graphic representation that shows exactly what these changes are in a graphic, easy to look at format. And some of the main changes, as you can see, is the title of the nutrition facts panel has changed. So now it is Declaración Nutrimental. So it changed from nutritional information to nutritional declaration. And you can see that some of the content is now bolded. There's additional graphic requirements aside from the bolding, which include the font size requirements, which were not required before. And most obvious is that while previously declaring the information per 100 grams or per serving or per portion or per container, I meant, where all options of how to declare the nutrition content of your product, now 100 grams or 100 ml for liquid products is the requirement. And adding the nutritional information per serving or per container are optional declarations rather than the requirement. But you must always declare the nutritional information per 100 grams or 100 ml, no matter what, in this new regulation requirement. And as you can see, some of the other nutrients are bolded, and this particular table includes all of the new mandatory requirements and some of the optional vitamins and minerals. And we're going to delve into this in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So the mandatory nutrients are your energy declared in kilocalories and kilojoules, protein, total fat, saturated fat. Your trans fatty acid is a new mandatory requirement. Your available carbohydrates, total sugars, added sugars, which is also new, total dietary fiber, and sodium. And your serving size is now per 100 grams or per 100 ml. And you may also display it per portion or per container. The two mandatory new ingredients are the trans fat and the added sugar. And something very important to note is that trans fat is declared in milligrams. And this is especially important if you are used to working with US labels, because in the US, we deal with trans fat in grams. So when you're entering information into your Mexico module, you must be sure that you're entering it into milligrams, as milligrams for trans fat, so that you don't get a really big amount or a really small amount if you're declaring it in the incorrect unit. Some of the other units that changed also were for some of the vitamins. So vitamin 1, B1, B2, B6, and copper were previously declared in milligrams, and now they're declared in micrograms. So again, just take careful note that you're using the correct unit of measure when entering information into Genesis. And vitamin D, the daily value has increased to 10 micrograms from 5 micrograms. And another important thing to note is that now voluntary vitamins and minerals can only be displayed on your nutrition facts panel if they're present in 5% or more. If they are less than 5%, they cannot be declared on the nutrition facts panel unless it is required by another standard. Additionally, the regulation has now provided some additional energy conversion factors. This table shows all of the conversion factors, but allulose and tagatose have now been added to Genesis to be considered in the calculation of energy. And your allulose and your polydextrose and tagatose have also been added to the nutrients that are available in the database. So Alicia will get into that a little bit further on in the presentation. I did want to make a note here about the conversion factors. Very important that when you're double checking the values that are generated in your nutrition facts panel, if you do a straight conversion of kilocalories to kilojoules when you're double checking your information, please note that Mexico does not do a straight kilocalorie to kilojoule conversion. They have individual conversion factors for kilocalories and kilojoules for the different nutrients. So Genesis has already incorporated these very specific conversion factors, and you don't have to worry about it, but we just don't want you to be thrown off by any difference you may see in that value. One of the other big requirements of this new updated regulation is that sugars, added sugars, must be grouped in the ingredient statement. So ingredients also, they still need to be declared in descending order of predominance by weight. The same thing with composite ingredients being declared parenthetically, but added sugars must be declared parenthetically and grouped together. And this also applies to composite ingredients. So if a composite ingredient has added sugars, you must also group these added sugars in your composite ingredients. The allergens, one big change here is that mollusk were added to one of the recognized allergens in Mexico. And a may contain statement is now required for Mexico. So if it's possible that your product is contaminated during production, the may contain statement is no longer optional, but mandatory. And it must immediately follow the declaration of your specific allergens. That is it for me, and I am going to hand it back now to Alicia. Thank you so much for participating.
Rosemarie, thank you so much for all of that wonderful, helpful information. With most regulatory changes, there's so much to be considered, so your guidance is especially appreciated here. And as she mentioned, I will move into Genesis and show you how these features have been incorporated into the 11.9 version as well as the Mexico label module. So before I get into any labels, let me just show you a few general additions that we've added for version 11.9 that everyone will be receiving. So I'm going to go to the Nutrients to View section. The Nutrients to View is where you go in Genesis to select the nutrients that you want to see on screen and on reports. And when you click on the Nutrients to View button here, you will see many sets of predetermined nutrients to view sets here. We have them kind of organized in these basic, a bit more specific topic groups, and then your label sets. So for version 11.9 of Genesis, we have added the Label Mexico 2020 All set, as well as the Label Mexico 2020 Mandatory. So just as they allude to, the 2020 mandatory set includes those nutrients that are required for the label, and then the 2020 all also include those voluntary nutrients that you can choose to report on the Mexico label. Within this Nutrients to View settings here, I will also show you, Rosemarie mentioned some of the new nutrients that we have to consider with the Mexico labels. When I click on Modify a Nutrients to View, based on the set that I have selected, you can see the nutrients included in this set. And if I choose Edit, it's going to show me all of the nutrients that are selected in this set, as well as those that are available. If I wanted to create my own set of nutrients to view, I certainly could do from here. But in the Other Nutrients section of this list, we have allulose, polydextrose, and tagatose. So again, allulose and tagatose are being used to calculate energy for your ingredients. So when you are entering your ingredients into Genesis and you populate allulose and tagatose fields, the information in those nutrient fields will be used to calculate energy based on the allowed factors, the calories conversion factors that can be used for those specific nutrients or components. And then polydextrose is allowed on the nutrition label for Mexico as a voluntary nutrient. So we've also added that to Genesis for inclusion on the labels. So that again is the Nutrients to View section in Genesis. In addition to those nutrients to view sets, we have also added in the software designations for your ingredients. So this is helping with the warning seals and warning statements and the ingredient statement features. So I'm going to open an ingredient here. In Genesis, when you are, again, adding a new ingredient to the software or you're viewing the ingredient records that may be already in Genesis, you see this view. It's the ingredient record screen. So the name, the nutrients tabs, and here we've added designations to the software. Is sugar was already present as essentially an indicator or a designation in the software from Canadian regulations, but this has been incorporated more into a general designations area. So we can accommodate Canadian and Mexico labeling of the items that meet the definition of sugars. The is sweetener designation is used to indicate ingredients that meet that definition of sweeteners, and that would then prompt the warning statement for sweeteners. And then is fat is used for oils or fats, again, those added fats that are included in recipes. You can mark your ingredients as is fat to consider the amount of fat contained in that ingredient, as well as the warning symbols or warning seals that need to be shown for Mexico labeling. So from the sugar example, you can see that we've marked it as is sugar so that Genesis will handle that appropriately when we're working with labels and ingredient statements. So now I'll move on to a recipe in Genesis. And I can show you how, again, how we've incorporated these new updated Mexico changes to the label settings. So here I have a recipe, and I'm going to go immediately to the edit label section. This is where we go when we want to set the options or the formatting and the views that we have for our labels. So just speaking in general about the edit label settings, we have this general section, and here is where you would choose the regulation of the label that you want to work with. Yours might be set to US, perhaps by default. Mine typically is, if I create a new recipe, then it's typical that my US set of regulations would show. And you can see there's a general section here, and then lower a section that is specific to the regulation I have selected. So I'll choose Mexico. And then this category line for any given country regulation, we may have more than one version of the regulations. Here, Genesis still includes the 2010 set of regulations. We won't do away with that until it would be appropriate to do so. We can't force you to switch all of your labels to the 2020 regulations at this time. You will need to work through your existing recipes and change those over to 2020 regulations as you deem fit. So in working with the most recent, we want to make sure that Nutrition Facts 2020 is selected for the category. Here we also have a few more options that I'll come back to. And then in general, we see the serving size information, servings per container, and those related features within this general section in the edit label features. So for serving size, if you need to add descriptive information in consumer-friendly terms, you can add volume references, the household measure information, terms like 1 piece or 1 pouch, whatever is appropriate to the product that you're working with. Keep in mind that there are English, French, and Spanish lines here available. So you want to fill in the fields that you'll be needing for your specific label. If you are producing Mexico labels in Spanish only, you do need to populate the Spanish term if you're using that field. It would be optional to populate the English or the French. The label is going to pull in whatever language is appropriate based on the regulation that you have selected. We also have options for hide the calculated serving size, which refers to the gram weight that is used when you've determined your recipe. So you set the serving size either by saying, my recipe makes so many servings, or a recipe weighs or serving weighs a specific amount in grams, and that is the calculated serving size. So there are options to work with those. And then servings per container is just a number field here, but you can populate that with whatever is needed. Again, for Mexico label, make sure that you do fill in the Spanish field when you're working with just a Spanish label. And there is an option to hide the servings per container. As I mentioned, the lower portion of this screen is specific to the Mexico label features. So we do have language order. In this case, these options are grayed out because with the Mexico label, it must be in Spanish. Bilingual is optional, but if a bilingual label is used, then Spanish would come first. And then the container size area here of these settings is used for the declaration of the calories or the energy per container. And if you're using a dual column label where you want to show the container information, we need to indicate the container size so that Genesis can calculate the appropriate nutrient amounts and energy amounts. By default, it's set to gram. You can choose a specific weight that is appropriate to your container or a volume measure. So just know if you're using one of the volume measures, you do need to indicate in Genesis a volume to weight equivalent. So again, Genesis can perform the proper math. So with that in mind, I'm going to close out of these options by choosing OK, and we'll view the label just to give kind of that basic view of our starting point for the label. So a few things here. I do have one voluntary nutrient selected so far, and you can see portion size that I've entered is filled in. This is the calculated serving size weight that I've indicated in my recipe, so it's pulling through to the label. I've entered the servings per container, and then we have calories information, and the nutritional information is reported by default as 100 grams. So again, you could choose to report as 100 milliliters or 100 grams here. Again, whatever is appropriate for the type of product that you're using. And then just quickly, I did mention that if you are using volume, a volume container size or references there in Genesis to give that volume to weight equivalent, go to Edit Recipe, and in the Measure section here, you can certainly add additional units rather than the default of grams and just weight. So here I've set 100 milliliters is equal to 107 grams. So I've given a volume to weight equivalent there. You can edit measures and add additional if, say, you needed to add piece information. 4 pieces equals so many grams, or any of these unit descriptors that would be appropriate to your product. You can add that information there. And one word on this, I've added my milliliters equivalent, so I don't have to continue populating a cup equivalent or fluid ounce equivalent or gallon or liter, etc. Once you've entered one volume to weight equivalent, then Genesis can convert the rest. So let me go back to our edit label options, and we have the format options. So again, we have kind of this general, more common set of options available to more than just the Mexico label set, but also the other countries. And then the lower section of the screen shows you rules that are specific to Mexico labels. I want to point out a couple here is that this first option, use unrounded values when calculating the percent standard, was reworded slightly with version 11.9 of Genesis. It used to say use unrounded values when calculating the daily value, but not all countries refer to that as daily value. So Mexico refers to the VNR as their standard. So now this was just reworded in a bit more common language or general language to accommodate the different countries. What it's doing or referring to is with your label, by default, Genesis will use rounded values to calculate a percent. So in this case, the percent BNR would be calculated from a rounded value here. If you choose this, use unrounded values to calculate the percent standard, then the underlying value that is unrounded here would be used to come up with the percent. And then again, in these settings, we have show bilingual. Another here is you can show the vitamins and minerals in this lower portion in 2 columns. The others here refer to allergen and ingredient statement formatting. And then within the Mexico specific section here, as we mentioned, you can report nutrients per 100 grams or per 100 milliliters. So I have mine set to 100 grams. I can easily switch that to 100 milliliters if I choose to. And then again, we have front of package and warning statement settings that I will discuss in just a few minutes. Here, related to the nutrient information on the label, we have rounding options, so regulation rounding rules, and then more specific options that could be used. So rounding to the nearest whole number, to the nearest tenth, to the nearest hundredth are certainly options. So if I choose to the nearest tenth, you can see that information here is reported to the nearest tenth. Note that it does also apply to the calories up here. So you may or may not want to have that displayed to the 10th. I'll show you one more option here, show percent BNR. When I choose that, then it's going to show my voluntary vitamins and minerals being reported in percent BNR per portion. So rather than the 100 milliliters or the 100 grams information or reference there, it's presenting it per portion per the regulations. And that option inserts this heading here as well as the footnote. I mentioned this rounding to the nearest 10th option. So under nutrient options in the Mexico label, edit label settings, we can select specific settings on how to display some of these nutrients. So for instance, less than statements could be handled in certain ways or reported in certain options. Calories, you know, I told you I set to round to the nearest 10th here. So it's also showing my calories to the nearest 10th, and perhaps I don't want that displayed to the nearest 10th. It might make more sense and is more consumer friendly to report as a whole number. So I can switch that option for calories specifically. And then again, voluntary nutrients is where you can select the additional information that you want to report on your nutrition facts label. So here I've chosen a few. You'll see vitamin C is showing up because, as Rosemarie mentioned, the VNR, percent VNR must be at 5% or greater in order for voluntary nutrients to show up. So my vitamin C is meeting that requirement. I have a couple other voluntary nutrients selected, iron and phosphorus, but at this point they're not in a great enough amount that they can be reported on my label. And then just one other mention of voluntary nutrients. Cholesterol, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat are essentially tied together. So if you choose to report cholesterol on the label, it will also bring in mono and polyunsaturated and vice versa. So checking any of those three nutrients will also pull in the other two for your label, such as this. So all of these options in the label settings, you know, a lot to work through. You will want to consider your product and the options and the preferences of display that are allowed for your types of product and what is friendly for consumers. So work through, get to know those label settings by viewing through those edit label options and see what's appropriate for your package. Let me go back to the general options now, and I've been showing you the standard vertical label. So under the style options in the edit label features, we also have the linear format, so to be used for those smaller packages. The dual column label per serving. So this might be appropriate for packages where you want to, for multi-serving packages, and you opt to show the proportion information or the per serving information. So the first column would be the 100 gram or 100 ml information, and then the second voluntary column is this proportion for the label here. And again, the other option here, dual column per container. So another optional label format you can choose. You have the 100 ml or 100 gram information in the first column, and then per container. So again, that's where it's important to enter that per container information, and if you have any volume, weight, conversions or equivalents that you need to consider for your product, that would be entered in Genesis like I showed you. So with that, we'll move on to the warning seals. Let me back up one step and show you here the warning seals that we're talking about here, these octagon shaped symbols, as Rosemarie mentioned, are prompted by certain thresholds and certain designations. So I do want to show you, if I have 100 grams selected for this particular recipe, it's showing one warning seal because of the solid form product. one warning seal is appropriate. When I switched it over to 100 mLs, there are different rules in the solids products versus liquid products or the beverages. And so Genesis is coded to trigger the appropriate warning seals based on whether you've selected grams or milliliters for your label. So with the warning seals, I'm going to edit my recipe a bit, just to show you how adding different ingredients to the formula can affect the warning seals. So I'm going to add an oil to this recipe, and I'm going to add it in an amount that may not seem reasonable. But again, this is for demonstration purposes and just to show you how it's going to affect the warning seals. So what I do want to make sure, this is an oil, and I'm going to open this ingredient record and double check the designations here. It's an oil, it's added fat. I'm checking this box of is fat in the designations area to indicate that when I use this product, the fat that is contributed by this ingredient is to be considered for my warning seals. So as you can see, I've added this ingredient. Now it's prompting more warning seals to be included and reported based on the saturated fat content and now the excess calories, where before it was just the excess sugars in my initial recipe. Rosemarie showed you the configurations that are allowed or required for these warning seals. And when you have 3 warning seals, there is an option to choose a vertical layout. The default setting is horizontal. We can switch to the vertical layout. So in doing so, it just slightly changes the configuration of the warning seals. And again, that's for when you are using 3 seals. The other formats, when we have 4, 5, or the 2, those are set in a specific configuration here. So again, going back to my recipe, I'll continue adding a couple more ingredients just to demonstrate how these are working. Here I have a margarine with partially hydrogenated oil because I know it will contain trans fat. This isn't maybe something we see in the industry anymore. But again, for the demonstration purposes, now you can see excess trans fat has been added in the warning seals. And then one more ingredient here to add. I'll just add some table salt. And so there again, you can see the warning seals, all 5 are indicated there. With the multiple warning seals, again, in this front of package layout, we do have the option for singular. So if it's a smaller package, it might be appropriate because of lack of space on the package to just show the singular formatting of the warning seals. So it's indicating the number of warnings that are applied based on this product. It doesn't list them individually, but it is telling us that this product contains ingredients or levels of nutrients that could be a concern, and indicating that by the warning seal. So then we have the warning statements. And again, I'll continue manipulating my recipe here just to demonstrate how the warning statements show up. So I'm going to specifically add caffeine. I'm intentionally adding this to my product. And here you can see that the warning statement regarding caffeine is now showing based on that ingredient that I added to my recipe. Now the caffeine is being driven by the caffeine nutrient field in the software. So Rosemarie mentioned there are naturally occurring caffeine occurrences, and then there's intentionally added caffeine to products. If your ingredient is not necessarily added or contributing to added caffeine that would require the warning, you can certainly choose to not show this warning statement. So there's a not shown option within the warning statements. And then again, there are a couple different options in the display. So we have a wide format for the statement as well as a narrow format, and you can choose between those. I'll add yet one more ingredient to this recipe. We're going to add a sweetener. Just throw in some ACE-K there. And again, with the sweeteners, this idea of designations. So I'm opening up this sweetener, double checking that it is in fact indicated with the is sweetener designation, so that when I have that in my recipe, it is prompting the warning statement related to sweeteners. Contains sweeteners not recommended for children. So again, just in general, with those designations and in general working with your ingredients that you add to Genesis, just as you would enter a new ingredient, check the nutrient information, check that its ingredient statement information is accurate and its allergens, you would also check the designations and consider if any designations would apply to the ingredient that you're working with. On that same note, if you're using any of the ESHA database items that are shipped with Genesis, you can edit certain fields. So one is these designations. You can't edit nutrient fields for an ESHA database item, but you can change allergens, update the ingredient statement information, and you can certainly assign the appropriate designations for that item. Now I will switch to the ingredient statement view. So here, just demonstrating this idea of the added sugars. So by indicating is sugar, when we worked with our white granulated sugar and here a cane sugar in this ingredient, you can see here in the ingredient statement view in Genesis, those are marked as is sugar, and then they're grouping the added sugars appropriately in your recipe. And then again, the allergens, just view the allergen statement information here, or the screen here. And again, as is true with allergens in Genesis, all of these are marked as indicating that they're containing all of the allergens. And mollusks has been in Genesis already, but it's new to the Mexico requirements. So now mollusks is considered one of the major allergens for Mexico labeling. But when you're working with your allergens, working with the ingredients in Genesis, you need to review each ingredient and mark the appropriate allergens for that ingredient. You can do that either on the ingredient level or here within the recipe settings and this allergen statement screen, you can clear out all of the allergens that you encounter here, or you can clear them out one ingredient at a time. Or again, go back to opening the ingredient record itself and then work with the allergens information there. So if I open this individual ingredient, there's an allergens tab here. And that's where you would indicate which would apply. That's really the best practice, immediately working with each ingredient as you add it to Genesis, mark the appropriate allergens, but you can always go back and review as needed. And one other item I do want to mention for the allergen statement in Genesis is that it is to be listed in bold. So at this time in the allergen statement options for Genesis, if you go to edit label and then object properties, there's an allergen statement area and you can select the font and the size and style that you need. So under this font line, you can certainly choose bold for the font style, and that will give you an allergen statement that is compliant. So that should get you started with the Mexico 2020 labels. I know there's a lot to cover and certainly more options as you work with your specific products. You'll want to consider what's appropriate and compliant for your labeling needs. And you can see that Genesis gives you many, many options. So if you find that you need additional training for Genesis features, for specific labeling topics, we offer throughout the year Genesis R&D training. Right now, all sessions are online only. We'll see where 2021 what 2021 brings for us. But we do have the first 3 months of training sessions available. You can see listed January, February, March. These are all in this general format that we offer. There's a 2-day professional level training, which kind of covers the fundamentals of Genesis and working through the basic features and some of the labeling information and talking about best practices. And then if you choose, you could add a 3rd day of advanced training. Or if you already have a good handle on Genesis, you can choose to just attend the 1-day advanced training as a single day instruction. And there are various ways to get a hold of ESHA. If you have any questions, need support, have questions about your license, need the Mexico label module or any other country labeling modules, you can certainly get a hold of us. If you have needs for specific training for your organization, please contact the training team at Training at ESHA, and they can discuss a schedule and a format that would best meet your needs. And then also, as always, you can follow us in the LinkedIn community. Check out the e-learning center that can be accessed through your Genesis on the ESHA website, and look for our blog and newsletters. You can certainly subscribe to those. And as we mentioned, go back to any of the archived webinars that we have on the ESHA website to learn more about Genesis. So with that, we'll get into a few questions and answers, and I'll have Rosemarie join me again for these. So Rosemarie, when you're ready.
Yes.
We have our first question is, what will happen to product already on the shelf if it doesn't bear the 2020 label and the front of package information?
So this is a great question, and I know it's in the front and center of everyone's mind, especially for products that have not expired, for instance. But at this time, unfortunately, the Mexico government hasn't indicated how the companies will be penalized or sanctioned if they have products on the shelves that don't meet the new labeling requirements. We're hoping they provide some more insight as the time goes on a little bit, but at this time, we do not know how the government will penalize any companies with products on the shelves.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it leaves a little bit up in the air, but hopefully we'll see more guidance soon.
Yes.
Next question we have is, can we prepare product packages showing phase 2 and 3 information?
Yes, absolutely. The government actually published a document not that long ago that indicated that products may be labeled and commercialized during phase 1 that already meet the requirements of the future phases. But what you cannot have is products that have phase 1 requirements during phase 2 or phase 3. So you can get ahead of the game, but you can't go backwards.
That completely makes sense. All right, thank you. One question that came up that was specific to a specific label, or customer's question: if my serving size is 100 grams, is it correct that the energy information is repeated on the label? I'll show an example of that in Genesis, but Rosemarie, if you could talk to that a little bit.
Absolutely. So if your product serving size is 100 grams, you are still required to display your energy per 100 grams and per container, and those two values could match if your product container size is 100 grams. So you could have the same value reported twice, but you do need to have it reported twice.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And we are close to the close of our webinar time, so I'm going to address one more question here. And like I said, for any that we didn't get to during this time or that the content of the webinar didn't address, we'll reach out to you directly. But for our last question, we do have, what if I use a composite ingredient from a supplier that has multiple sugars in it? In Genesis, how do I list the ingredient statement information? So In Genesis, this is kind of a general question anyhow, excuse me, but when you have a recipe and you know the amounts of each ingredient in the recipe, Genesis is compiling the ingredient statement automatically. However, if you have an ingredient from a supplier, a composite ingredient that you don't know the amounts of the sugars, as Rosemarie mentioned, when you have a composite ingredient and you have multiple added sugars within that ingredient, those can be listed within parentheses following the ingredient name, the composite ingredient name. So you'd have your list of ingredients in your ingredient list, and then composite ingredient name, parentheses, and the ingredients that are contained in that composite ingredient. Your supplier is not likely going to give you their formula, so you wouldn't know how much of each ingredient and each sugar is contained in there. But within Genesis, when you are working with the ingredients, and again, checking your ingredient statement information, your allergens, your designations, within the ingredient statement area, you can use these sections of the ingredient statement to provide additional information. So for a composite ingredient from a supplier, the composite ingredient name would go here in the ingredient statement name, and then there's a section for sub-ingredients. So when you check sub-ingredients, you can begin typing here, type any text here, and you would place that in parentheses. So you may need to do a little consideration, repeat of the ingredient list, the ingredient statement that your composite ingredient supplier provides you, and type that parenthetical information directly into the ingredient statement information and fields. So I hope that helps explain it. We have a separate webinar that covers specifically ingredient statements. So you can refer to that in the archives if you need more information on preparing those. So that is all the time we have for today. Rosemarie, again, thank you so much for being here today and sharing all this information.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next time. Thanks.